Okay, we are live.
Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is really going to be so much fun and educational for me because I am reading somewhat outside my normal literary boundaries. So I'm going to rely on author Megan Shepherd, whose gorgeous book, Malice House, we're going to discuss. Somewhere or other, Megan, I've never actually ventured much into Shirley Jackson or horror territory, or Patrick will come back and talk to us about Lovecraft. But I gather this is a bit of a departure for you as well.
It is. I come from a young adult background. I have 10 books out. This is my 11th book, and it's my first book for an adult audience. My other books do deal with some sinister, slightly paranormal, gothic thriller vibes. Nothing quite as Lovecraftian, as you mentioned, as Malice House is. But yeah, I think I'm kind of known for that gothic vibe. And so this just brings the gothic feeling into a modern Pacific Northwest setting, which is a pretty good place to set it, I think. It captures that tone well.
I think it does too, and we'll talk about the Gothic. But let me say before we go any further that Megan has very kindly signed copies of Malice House, which are somewhere between her home and the Poison Pen. And this is our notable new fiction book for October, because I felt like we should all be somewhere in October. It's the perfect month for it, which, even if you'll notice the orange print on the book, I think that undoubtedly publishers who are pretty savvy about this kind of thing thought that October would be an excellent month to release this book. So lucky us.
Yeah, right. I'm really so honored and flattered that you guys chose it. Thank you so much for doing that. And yeah, it's definitely no coincidence. They released it before Halloween. It definitely has some of that Stephen King feel to it, Shirley Jackson as well. So, I don't think it's not particularly gory. It's not it's not for hardcore horror fans, but it's for all those people that like thrillers, mysteries, just that kind of extra spooky element to their stories.
Very true. And we have a book within a book, which is always fun because biblio-mysteries are something that most of our customers really like. But before we get to that, let me talk about Megan for a minute. And then I want to talk about the Gothic, because those of you who've been listening to me for the last 3 years know that I predicted the comeback of the Gothic at least 2 years ago. And I've done a series of Zoom conversations with Jane Ann Krentz and Jane T. Ellison about it. And we're always kind of trying to work out a great definition for the Gothic, and then all the little sub-Gothics, for example, railroad Gothic, because there are train stories now that are Gothic. I mean, you can divide them all up, probably fashion Gothic, whatever. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Megan, I think, is interesting because she too comes from a bookselling background. So tell us a little bit about that. It's probably not a coincidence that you have a book within a book in the book.
No, it isn't. Yes, this book is a little bit of a celebration of the book industry. It's got booksellers in it, librarians in it, publishers in it, authors, illustrators, and it talks a little bit about the publishing industry and the bookselling world. So yeah, I've always loved books within a books about the book world, and this is very much delving into all of that. Yeah, but I was fortunate enough to have grown up my whole life in a small independent bookstore. My parents owned a bookstore in the Southern Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina for 40 years, my whole childhood. And we lived just a few blocks away. So every day after school, I would just go to the bookstore and curl up with some Christopher Pike and R.L. Stine. And of course, as I grew older, helped out, worked in the bookstore as well. And they sold the bookstore about 5 years ago, but it's under great new ownership in my hometown. I did my launch party there last night, and it's just such a special place to me. And just to have grown up literally just surrounded by books was truly a dream.
I can imagine so. What's the name of the bookstore?
It's called Highland Books in Brevard, North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
Just a really charming store. The new owners are doing a fantastic job, and it just thrills me to see it still thriving and doing so well.
It is very nice. It's nice for your parents that their legacy didn't disappear. I'm giving the poison pen to my staff. So that's my exit strategy because I would hate to see it disappear.
Oh, wow. I
I
mean,
know.
yeah, independent bookstores are really so the lifeblood of towns and they're so essential. Um, so
Well,
yeah,
right. They really have in many ways kind of substituted for when I grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, we had something called the Community House, which was a place funded by the city. And it had a movie theater and a bowling alley and meeting rooms and and that's where people gathered. And some of those institutions are not as common anymore. And bookstores often can fulfill that. They're also a wonderful place to go to escape daily life. We made, there are all kinds of independent bookstores, but we at the Poison Pen made a conscious decision to be a place of entertainment and escape. You could call her a shallow if you want, but there are mission-driven bookstores. There are all kinds of, varieties of bookstores. But I think you have to pay attention to the community that you're in. And so for your parents in Brevard, it sounds like that was their kind of bookstore. For Scottsdale, I think that we have the right kind of bookstore. And if we were located somewhere else, then we'd probably be different.
Yeah, that's what makes independent bookstores so special, so different from big chains or online things, is that you're totally tailored to the community.
Yeah. Well, we are, and you need to react to that. But I think it's really interesting. You're not the first young adult author that has come my way recently who has decided to write adult fiction. So I think an interesting question would be, what's the difference? When you're writing define young adult, and then tell me what you had to do differently to write what you think of as adult fiction.
Think of young adult, whether it's contemporary young adult or dystopian. I mean, young adult can comprise many different genres, but I think the one thing they all have in common is that it's about young people who are really trying to discover what their identity is, what it's going to be looking forward. They're trying to find what their place is going to be in the world. And with this book, with Malice House, I always knew that the main character, she's a 30-something kind of failed artist. She's sort of already found her place in a sense. And the book is less about, trying to forge a path and more dealing with the repercussions of the choices she's already made and some of the mistakes that she's made in her life. Right. And so it's less forward looking and more, dealing with the ramifications of who she is.
Did you change, do you change your writing style at all? I mean, do you make different vocabulary choices or sentence structure choices? Is young adult like what, 14 to 18? I mean, I know it's just arbitrary because I was an adult reader when I was like 11. So, I passed the young adult thing without ever even noting what it was.
Yeah, so was I. Young adult genre was not a big thing when I was a young adult myself, but I think they say like 12 to 18 usually. And then there's lots of adult readers of young adult work as well.
There are, that's absolutely right. There've been some recently that have come out sort of, there's one about Nancy Drew, some kind of a contemporary mystery about and all. And, I think I sort of I feel like I have to say young adult, but the truth is I'd rather just put it out there as something anybody could read it. Above, let's say, middle school age, because I'm sure, we're having a hot debate all over the country about what people under 12 can read at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually one of the things that inspired this book. Just to tell you a little bit about what the book is about. It's about this 30-something woman, Haven, who is an aspiring artist. She's the daughter of a famous literary writer who's won the Pulitzer, and he's recently passed away. So she goes to his house to clear out his things and finds this hidden manuscript, a secret manuscript that no one's known about. And so she wants to illustrate the manuscript and try to sell it that way to launch her art career. And in illustrating these characters, strange things start to happen in town, murders start to happen, everything has some monstrous tones to it. And she starts to wonder if maybe the characters that she's illustrated have sort of stepped off the page. So the book is really about kind of the question about, are books dangerous? Are ideas dangerous? When authors and artists create an idea and put it out there, what happens to it? It takes on a life of its own. And it came out of thinking about all the books that are being banned. And, you know, of course, it's ridiculous to ban books about menstruation for 12-year-olds to read. I mean, you have to think about who are books really dangerous for, you know, and books can be dangerous for oppressive regimes. I mean, there's lots of books that have challenged a lot of ideologies and things like that. So
Which
the book
sort of where the banned book, if I may interpolate, this is really where the whole banned book thing is coming from, is it's threatening some ideologies in this country. And, you know, there's a whole thing about trying to control people's personal lives going on. And this is part of it. And I think the folly of not, I mean, there are a lot of reasons to ban, for people wanting to ban books, but when it comes to, for example, sex education and so forth, if you don't do that and you're going to ban abortion and you're going to ban contraceptives, where do they think this is going to go? And they don't want to pay for, you know, the consequences of it, which are, you know, loads of children that are going to struggle and so forth. I mean, none of it makes any sense. And you know, I think it's become like a political ideology thing at the moment, where people are not doing any long range thinking about what the consequences of it are.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, profanity is one thing maybe, or, you know, too much violence or something. That's a different thing. But to try, you know, not to teach young people about themselves and their bodies makes no sense to me at all.
Yeah, I agree. And so, yeah, when I was thinking about writing this book, a lot of it came out of thinking about the idea that books are dangerous, but more thinking specifically about the creators of books and what's our role, what's your responsibility to what you create and put out there. And of course, this book, it's fiction and it's Gothic horror, so it takes a pretty sinister turn. But yeah, I think that's just a fascinating idea. So much we're thinking about being held accountable for our ideas, you know, and what that can mean.
Yeah, and it's a dangerous time. I mean, you know, it makes me feel like we're going to go back to Munich and public book burning, or Savonarola in Florence, or whatever it is. And it never does any good. And in fact, you know, oftentimes people's efforts to ban books simply make the books more in demand. It's almost like a marketing strategy for, you know, seriously, it is.
Yeah.
And I ran across a bookstore today reading about it, where they've started a banned book subscription club. And I thought,
nice.
What a really good idea. You know, I mean, if I had like one more staff person at the Boys and Men, I would subscribe to that. And they're teenagers that are putting together, you know, ways to discuss or ways to acquire and the whole bit. They're actually piquing curiosity in a way that if they'd left well enough alone, very well might not have been the case. But
yeah,
I you know, I love the ideas behind your book. But in order to make it really work, tell me what you think the Gothic is, because this is a term that's being so frequently used at the moment, and, you know, wrestling into what does it mean when you say Gothic, especially Gothic with a capital G.
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of the technical term deals with the way emotion is expressed, very high emotion, bordering on melodrama sometimes. Setting is obviously a huge component, whether or not it takes place in, you know, windswept rural England, which we may think of as a lot of Gothic Wuthering Heights type fiction, or whether it just captures a lot of that brooding, mysterious, haunted tone that could take place anywhere, you know. And I think some of the most successful books juxtapose setting and might set it someplace very surprising, but do manage to capture that same tone. I think there's a lot of sort of feelings of isolation in it, perhaps even claustrophobia. I think the character relationships are always key in Gothic fiction. Doesn't have to be romance, but just, like I say, high emotion, high drama. That's sort of what I've always considered Gothic to be, as well as just some of the really fun tropes and elements like cool old houses and castles and
Right.
yeah, you know.
Yeah, I definitely think, the Gothic generally is some sort of contained environment, whether it's I mean, the fall of the House of Usher, the Castle of Otranto, Rebecca, all that stuff. So setting is a major component. I think there's always, as you say, high emotion, but some degree of terror or fear or the inexplicable, comes along I mean, oftentimes it can have a prosaic explanation, but while you're going through it, it may seem, as I said, I'm not a Shirley Jackson reader. But that must be what she tapped into. I mean, are you a Shirley Jackson reader?
It's been a long time, but that was one of those things back when I would spend all afternoon in my parents' bookstore. Shirley Jackson and Stephen King were a lot of the ones I picked up. And I think she does such a great job having like The Haunting of Hill House is just so iconic, and having the house really be the setting, but also the villain, also the character. That's a trope I always love. And that's in Malice House, of course, you can guess it's a little bit about a haunted house. And, having the house be both someone's haven and someone's prison, I think is a really great and very Gothic sentiment to have, where a house embodies so much of a family history, just those ideas of safety separating you from other people, but then what if the house is what's dangerous? And a lot of that for me came out of, I wrote this book during the pandemic, and my house here that I live in is a 130-year-old farmhouse. It's very isolated out in the North Carolina rural countryside. And we didn't know this before we bought it, but all the neighbors quickly told us that it was haunted. Oh. And we've had some strange things happen since we moved in. But, me being here for 2.5 years during the pandemic, I love this house so much. I'm here with my family, but at the same time, I got very claustrophobic, felt very cut off. Like I say, we had strange things happen with our house. And so, writing this book about Malice House and this sort of sinister things that were happening was just like probably a source of therapy for me to deal with my own feelings.
Well, I can see that. I mean, you're right. It can be safe and it can be dangerous. It can be embracing, and yet people want freedom. I've always thought the reason Rebecca was so powerful was that really when the house was destroyed, that was the end. There's no coming back from that. And, the narrator never actually has a personal name. She's just Mrs. DeWinter. And while the dead Rebecca is, a presence that is so powerful, really Manderley is the focus of the book. And I think that that's true. And so I haven't read The Castle of Otranto since I was like a teenager, but that's one of the very, very early Gothic, 18th century Gothic, written by Horace Walpole. And I think cited in Jane Austen, people used to scare themselves, by reading, I think I have that right, or maybe it's The Monk by Monk Lewis. But anyway, Austen even, cites one of these Gothic classics as something that, people sat around and in the Regency or before, because she actually wrote a lot of her books before the real Regency, scared themselves with. So I would think for a young audience too, because, think about roller coasters and stuff. Kids like to scare themselves, right? It's a big, so I would, I can see that this would appeal very much to younger readers. I wonder how, do you feel like it attracts an older audience as well? I don't know enough about it to really speak to that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, there's nothing in it that I think would be inappropriate for teen readers as far as content, but at the same time, I did write it for an adult audience. And the books I tend to pick up and read for myself are more adult fiction than YA fiction. And so I had that in mind, the kind of things that I really love to read, as an adult reader. And so the tone, the situations the main character is dealing with do reflect an adult perspective more. And, I think certainly any book lover who has anything to do with bookstores or libraries or anything like that is going to get a lot out of the book that maybe younger readers just, might not have that same experience. But struggling, people struggling with the workforce, there's several characters in the book, like there's a barista in town who is also a literary forger on the side. And she's maybe 20 something, a little bit younger. And she and the main character, Haven, are just sort of both just kind of dealing with being an adult, working in the job market, dealing with parental issues, aging parents, deceased parents, that kind of thing. And so I do think that it is just speaking more to the adult readership.
I find that often characters in stories like this are somewhat unmoored. In this case, for example, Haven, her marriage has failed, her father's died. And, maybe that means they're more vulnerable to, to being scared. Maybe they're also more driven to being safe. Haven, it's an excellent name because that's part of what you're talking about here. Nothing is by accident,
Right.
It's by design. But that's often true that, when you read these kinds of stories, that people are in crucial parts of their lives. They're in because I say they're unmoored from what was normal for them, and it makes them more vulnerable to whatever is going to go on. And in this case, this is also, it's not a direct father and daughter story because dad has died, but nonetheless, Haven is, by finding the manuscript in the hall bit, it's a way of kind of holding on to a bit of her father, isn't it?
Yeah, and she's got an extremely complicated relationship with him and his legacy. She's always lived in the shadow of his very famous legacy and wants to make a name for herself as well, but really struggles to do that. And now has the opportunity to perhaps, leverage his posthumous fame to launch her own career. But does she really want to do that? Or does she want to just, strike out on her own? And so I think the book deals a lot with just those questions of, she never got to address a lot of the tensions and problems she had with her father when he was alive. And so now she has lost that opportunity. And how do you deal with those lost chances to make things right? And also just realizing how little you actually might know someone in your own family, uncovering all these secrets about him, and just sort of what that can mean for yourself. And then knowing that you've inherited a lot of their traits and seeing some of their dark qualities in yourself. And, are you going to follow the same fate that he did? All those questions are things that I think a lot of us are going through right now.
Well, and there's also, a question of whether his end years were, in any way, dementia entered into it, whether what he thought about the house or about his writing and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So, she has to worry about that a little bit too, because sometimes that's an inherited quality. And, do these characters that she wants to illustrate, how real are they? Or, were they inspired by dementia, that kind of thing. So there's an awful lot going on, but let's talk about the book business parts of it here, because, isn't it fascinating that when you have it's a treasure hunt kind of a thing that goes on here. If you have a famous literary person and, everybody wants to find like the lost Shakespeare manuscript,
Mm-hmm.
or, the Mozart symphony that nobody noticed that's in somebody's attic, or, the Sherlock Holmes book that really is in a battered tin dispatch box somewhere in Canada or whatever. And so, do you think, there's a lot of value attached to something like that. Some of it's just monetary, because if this is a famous person and it's a, previously unpublished work or whatever, there could be tremendous money involved. Mm-hmm. But there are what other features did you consider when when you're putting this manuscript into play?
Yeah. So the book within a book, the manuscript she finds is called Bedtime Stories for Monsters. And the idea is that his other works are like quite highbrow and literary, contemporary Americana fiction sort of thing. And this one is a departure from that. And it's these kind of macabre, dark, short story, interlocking short stories with sort of demonic characters. And so Haven sort of knows that there's going to be a lot of questions about, is this really his work? Because it's not signed, it's handwritten, but it's not signed. And so she knows that she's going to have to prove that it's really his. And so that's where like the literary forger comes in, and she has to go deal with some of the local towns, the colorful book local townspeople to try to get it authenticated and that sort of thing. And yeah, so everyone she approaches, the local bookseller whose ex-husband is an editor, so he's got the New York publishing connections. They're all just so intensely focused on this discovered manuscript. And it makes sense, as you said, there's huge monetary component. There's the kind of fame and bragging rights associated with finding something like this. And so everyone wants a little bit of a piece of it, but their interest also seems to go a little bit beyond just monetary interest. And they're like quite fixated on getting their hands on the manuscript, which is one of the mysteries Haven has to try to figure out. What exactly is it about it that has captured everybody's interest so much?
So, in a way, there's an opportunity here for bad behavior, bad actors, which if you're going to write a thriller, you have to have bad actors, because that's the whole point of a thriller, is that you have, here are your good guys and here are your bad guys, and what happens between them and who's going to come out at the end with the prize and the whole bit. But I really enjoyed, the sort of evil bookseller or bad actors or whatever it all is in here, because they aren't. I mean, you think normally of people in this whole industry as, agents of civilization and literacy and all the rest, and then you recognize that they're just as subject to market forces and greed and a desire for fame. I remember years ago, I've always loved this, Tony Hillerman, who was a real icon and was one of the first people to, in mystery anyway, where landscape and another culture became main characters and were so important. And he wrote a book called Thief of Time, which became his one Edgar winner, considered the best book of the year. And also, when I was teaching at ASU, I had a reading list, and that was one of the books. And I was just fascinated by the point of the story is really like what we're talking about. I know this is something of a spoiler, but ultimately it's about academics gaining fame and bragging rights from, an illegal pot hunting expedition. And the students, not one of them could believe that it was a powerful enough motive, for murder and all. They're going, seriously, just getting like a promotion in the English department or whatever. They just found that to be unbelievable. And I thought about that later, that what seems like high stakes in some worlds, like the literary world, isn't considered high. I mean, money is a common denominator. Okay, so something's really worth a lot of money, it doesn't really matter. But the other kinds of high stakes that can attach to objects and so forth are not high stakes for everybody, are they?
It's true. Yeah. And I think that with this book, I had to bring readers into that world and help them understand why that is high stakes. And because I've had experience on the bookseller side, the author side, and I've worked in publishing as well. And so seeing kind of a 360 view of the book world, it's that kind of thing is incredibly important to the book world and could absolutely be strong enough motivation. And so I liked showing all the different sides of books and publishing and selling. And like you said, having some of those, usually booksellers are the, sweet little small town hero kind of thing. And it's like, well, maybe they could be murderers too. You never know.
Absolutely true. Now, I did have a moment. There's a wonderful author who was a publisher, probably maybe still is even, Jason Recolek, his name is. I don't know if you've run across him.
Mm-mm.
And when Patrick comes to join us, he can remind me the name of his book. But he had a book that was very Gothic-y and had a lot going on, but he chose to tell part of the story, give a voice to one of the characters, a child really, by illustrating. So her voice was actually a picture in the,
wow.
all in the book. And it was really powerful because the art that she drew progressed. And when you got to the very last picture, it revealed to you what had been going on. And I thought to myself when I was reading this, and there was all this illustration and all, that it would have been interesting if you were, of an artistic bent. Might have been fun to, tell part of the story through the drawings, because we just have to imagine them, don't we?
Yeah, and we did talk about that. My editor and I talked about that. That was my original vision. The way the book is now, every chapter is started by an excerpt from the book within a book.
Right.
And so you get a little snippet of all 8 up stories of this Bedtime Stories for Monsters discovered manuscript, which I love. Now I absolutely love that. But my original vision was not to include those. And I really wanted us to include some kind of graphic novel-y illustrations, because that's the artwork that the main character does in the book.
This
Yeah,
is the
exactly.
title page for one of the titles, and you can see where the literary quote is. And I agree. I really like that. I mean, I think that's a lot of fun to read. The Recollet book, Patrick reminds me, is called Hidden Pictures, which right there tells you something.
Oh, yes, I've been hearing a lot about that. Yeah.
Probably, I mean, but I thought, how really interesting. It was such an interesting marriage of print and art. And then I did a program with the Library of Congress last week, because my husband's grandfather donated their greatest collection, Lessing Rosenwald. And one of them was the Great Manse Bible. And while we were looking at the Great Manse Bible, I recognized that it's the illustrations in those manuscripts that really are the most powerful part of the storytelling, the way they take the initial capital letter and they make it fabulous. Or there were books of hours that, were beautifully illustrated, and it was all part of the story. And then I remember taking my 8-year-old granddaughter to the cloisters in New York, and I thought she was going to be really bored. I took her up there for the experience of the cloisters, because it's this amazing building and it's up in Washington Heights and, all this other great stuff. It's the medieval branch of the Met. And I thought she was going to be bored, and she skipped happily from one picture to another and all. And I thought, and then I realized it, because she started telling me what the stories were in the pictures and naming the characters, that she had learned this sort of thing, in Sunday school.
Oh, yeah.
And so the pictures, which were, after all, that was the point, of many of them, was for an illiterate population in order to tell them stories. So here was Mariah pretty close, to one of those, the illiterate population. But the stories, the art spoke to her about the story in a way that she wouldn't have been able to read it. And so I really think that the graphic novel making a comeback in Jason's book illustrate how valuable it can be to have your narrative, in fact, also have art telling part of the story.
Yeah, I love the union between art and fiction and writing. And that's in the book, you sort of find out that there's this curse happening, and that the curse requires 2 things. It requires writing a story, a narrative that's written down, and then also the physical visual manifestation of that with the artwork. And I just really like that idea that an idea or a character is not really complete until it has both parts. It's sort of like the story, the written story is these characters' soul, and then the artwork is their body, their physical body. And it takes both of those things. And if you don't have both things, you might get something even more monstrous.
Wow,
that comes
that's
out
a
of it.
really good point. Do you have any artistic talent yourself, or would you have had to have somebody come in and do the artwork?
Oh, I would have loved to have tried it myself, but I know my limitations. I know it would not have sufficed, but yeah, but I did spend quite a lot of time going through different artists' portfolios and trying to see, try to find an artist that matched my main character's style. Not so much because we ever thought we would commission anything, but just so that I could, talk about the medium that she used, the brushwork and that sort of thing. And I mean, there's just such creative things happening right now, like in that graphic novel space. And it is
really,
being
yeah,
seen
there really is.
as even fine art to an extent.
We did an event for Alice Feeney at the end of August, and her book Daisy Darker, which is really a Gothic, and has some apparently supernatural elements. But the elderly woman who is the head of the family and sort of the part of the focus of the book is a children's book illustrator, and made her fortune by illustrating other people's books and then deciding she was going to illustrate her own. And so she lives in a house on an island off the coast of Cornwall. And I mean, it's the whole Gothic thing to a great degree. But I found it fascinating that it was a children's book illustrator who had made enormous amounts of money, through her work, and found that was the way she could tell her own stories, was, by illustrating children's books rather than illustrating other people's children's books. So I think that was a recognition from Alice that maybe art is coming back into books, into just fiction in a way that we haven't seen for a long time. I mean, look at the Strand magazine, for example. Sherlock Holmes would never have taken off if it hadn't been for, the incredible, what's his name? I think his name is Paget. Sidney Paget, I think, is the guy that illustrated, and so that whole thing we have of Holmes with the Meerschaum pipe and the deerstalker and, all the Holmesian image really came from the Paget illustrations in the magazine. And it's almost impossible to disassociate yourself from that if you're a Sherlockian.
Yeah. And now we have all of these AI programs that are doing artwork. And I don't know if you've seen any of them, Dolly, or I forget what they're called, but you can give them a prompt and they create, in some cases, very creative, very unusual manifestations of the prompt that you give them. And it's going to change, the art world dramatically. But at the same time, there is something missing in them. You can't necessarily tell that they're made by a computer, but there's something a little bit soulless about them. And I think it is that there's this a story missing. It's purely just visuals, and that no one has been behind it, really shaping and giving a story to the image as well. So I don't think it'll ever completely replace, human artists, of course.
No,
but it's a little bit of a science fiction nightmare in a sense.
Wow. No, I'll have to look into it. I don't know anything about it. Patrick, come and join us and let's talk about, or you can talk about, because I can't, Lovecraft.
Hello. What would you like me to say?
I don't know. I don't know anything about Lovecraft, and Malice House has been described as having Lovecraftian. It says perfect for fans of Home Before Dark and Lovecraft country. So what would that mean to you as a person who knows Lovecraft?
Let's see. When I think of Lovecraft, I think of kind of surrealistic fiction. I think of they call it speculative fiction, but and Shirley Jackson too. So much of it, we're talking, Megan, tomorrow night about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There's Leslie Klinger has put out this gorgeous new annotated edition of that book, and and I've always loved that story, and I think it resonates on so many levels and is so contemporary. And it sounds a little bit like what you're talking about, that with the shadow side of our personalities. And when you were discussing the book, which actually I'm going to need to steal that ARC, Barbara, because this book sounds great.
I'll give it to you tomorrow in return for your hosting the conversation with Les about Dr. Jekyll.
Oh yeah, I'd be happy.
Way better prepared for that than I am.
I would be happy to do that. But I couldn't help but think of The Shining, You've got the writer,
Mhm.
working on his manuscript. And at the end, you find out it's all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. He's just written that over and over again. And it sounds like there are elements of madness
Mhm.
kind of flit throughout the book. So that's sort of what I think about with Lovecraft. I mean, obviously he's created this whole mythos, with Cthulhu but it's like with Edgar Allan Poe, there's a lot of shared traits of madness and the occult in some ways. But I don't know. I'm kind of on the spot here.
No, that's a great summary. Yeah, and I'm not quite as familiar with Lovecraft's works, but the ones that I have read, yeah, do have a lot of that Gothic feel as well. A lot of, I mean, certainly explicit horror and explicit supernatural speculative elements, but often start out with more of the mystery and more of the, is it madness or what exactly is happening, which has always been a vibe that I've really loved.
And the house as a metaphor for the mind,
Yeah,
a lot of it's very internal the real horror is the internal horror, I guess.
Yeah, and yeah, I love thinking about the house as a body, and
Yeah.
In Malice House, the attic is where the famous author kept all of his manuscripts and did all his work, like the brain, and then you've got, the creepy basement, the crawl space, which is much more visceral, like our inners, that
Right.
sort of thing. But it's interesting you mentioned Jekyll and Hyde. My first young adult series were all retellings of classics, and it was The Island of Dr. Moreau, Jekyll and Hyde, and Frankenstein, sort of all tied up together. And so, yeah, I just did so much research on H.G. Wells and a lot of his contemporaries to write those books. And I think it's just so ingrained in me to talk about the relationship between like a creator and a creation, like Dr. Moreau or Frankenstein. That's very much like my first book, which is a Dr. Moreau retelling, is about a scientist who is creating abominations through science. And then this in a sense is a bit similar, where it's just an artist creating abominations through art. But I think that that's just one theme my works keep coming back to, just the power of creation.
Right.
Well, I think it's clear that nothing can frighten you more than what goes on in your own mind. It's far more terrifying than externals. When I was in library school, which was forever ago, I took a class in fantasy and horror. And, I remember Mervyn Peake and Gormenghast, for example.
Right.
Some things are more bizarre than others. We looked at Lovecraft. We read Ursula Le Guin because that wasn't scary, but wonderful. I love the Earthsea trilogy. I've loved it ever since. I thought it was so remarkable. And Peter Beagle's, trying to remember, The Last Unicorn, I think that's what it's called. Mm-hmm. And those are kind of the happier side in a way of, what goes on in your head, where it's not real, but it's not terrifying. And then you have the dark side. So writers do you think writers to a great degree are simply trying to put down on paper what's milling around in our brains and make sense out of it?
I think writers have an ability to think and look at the world a little bit more straight on. Like, I know a lot of people who just won't watch The Hunger Games because they have kids, and it's very scary to think about kids being in danger, which I totally understand. I have kids too, but it doesn't bother me as much. I don't like it. I don't like watching violence, but I can watch it. I like to think about the dark and the light side. I like to consider the whole picture in life. I don't like to just sort of focus on the positive or whatever. And I think a lot of authors are like that, where we just sort of have this ability to take a step back and just really truly consider the whole picture, including a lot of the dark and the scary and the ugly sides as well. And that's one of our gifts as an artist. And in the book as well, there's the main character, her side gig is recapping horror movies that most people are too scared to watch, like really dark horror movies. And that she always says that they don't bother her. She can watch them and she knows it's just fiction. And I think that that's a little bit of that spirit of some people don't like to face that stuff, and other people can look at it and can translate that to another audience to help them kind of understand and put it in context.
Who are the ink drinkers?
Oh, the ink drinkers in the book is this. The book takes place in this small seaside town in the Pacific Northwest, sort of near the San Juan Islands. And the town has this great bookstore called Lundy Bay Books, and it's created a literary salon with the famous author in town and the bookseller and the bookseller's editor husband, and then the local university librarian. And so they have formed this, what they consider highbrow literary salon. And the main character makes the mistake of calling it a book club, and they get quite upset about that. But I think ink drinkers is the French term for bookworm, what we would call like a bookworm. They call I forget what it is in French, but it translates to ink drinkers. And I came across that one day, and I thought it was such a visceral, strange, yet very accurate way of describing book lovers.
That would be a good YA book title, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Mhm.
it would be.
Ink
Very,
drinkers.
actually,
Series.
what's the new Robert Galbraith title? Has ink in it.
Good question.
It's just there in the store. But I was thinking, while you're looking that up and we're talking that, for some authors, some of them sort of flirt on the edge of madness or addiction, like, for example, Poe would be a good person, and maybe Monk Lewis and whatever it all is. But then I think, I don't know Stephen King, but I do know Dean Koontz very well. And in maybe he's the most pragmatic person I know, and yet look what he writes. And so it isn't, in his case, it's not madness, or I think it's fascination. And as far as I can tell, Stephen King is a perfectly sane person who is a workaholic and has an astonishing imagination, but he too likes to explore on the fringes while remaining sane, where some people can't do that. And there have been books within books where the author actually becomes insane, or the artist becomes insane in the act of creating and flirting around on the edges of reality. So it's a fascinating.
Well, and you get the not to go too far left field, but you get a lot of these unreliable narrators, that whole tradition in literature. I'm not Stiller, or you think of any of the Beckett characters, who are constantly questioning their own sanity, and you're not sure whether what they're telling you is reality. Or Philip K. Dick, so many of his books touch on those same kind of themes. And I think that is terrifying to realize that, oh my gosh, this is we talked about the allegory of the cave. Is this reality, or is this just
right?
Yeah. So those kind of themes.
Or will the work make you mad? I think that's another interesting question. Can doing it actually make you mad?
Well, 2.5 years trapped in an isolated house during COVID with two toddlers, that can make you mad.
Oh my gosh. A gentle madness.
Yeah.
It is, and we all had different experience of COVID. My life was hardly even touched by it. I mean, my grandchildren are gone away. We live in a big house in a relatively safe place. And, nothing in my life was really different other than wearing a mask. And we didn't get to talk to readers in person or authors in person, but Zoom came along and saved us.
Yeah.
And really, if there's one thing that's coming out of this for the book world, it's the transformative power of Zoom, which has allowed things to happen that would never have been feasible financially or in any other way beforehand. So we're all trying to figure out what this new reality is. But I do think I do think that your experience was clearly very different than my experience, and that would very much affect, what you're writing. Are you and your family and your community back out again, as though we're past through the pandemic and back to real life?
Yeah, we are. We are now. Life is very much back to normal now, which is great. We actually all just got COVID for the first time about 2 weeks ago, but we're fully vaccinated, and my kids are now fully vaccinated. So it was luckily very mild. But yeah, I think just I had my second child just a few weeks before the shutdown happened, and so it was
That
just
would be hard.
would have been an isolating time. Early motherhood's kind of an isolating time anyway, and you put the pandemic on top of that, and yeah, it was very, very intense, but it just makes you so grateful for what you have, and makes me so grateful for this career where I can just daydream all day. It's just what I want to be doing, and I feel so fortunate that I grew up in the bookstore the way I did, and that this was a career that was available to me.
Well, I think, we all are fortunate if we find that thing that which we love to do. So, wonderful for you. I found it later in life. Patrick's been there from the beginning. Did you, you're an English major, Patrick. You were always a book lover, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And a reader. So
Yeah.
even though we are reading in different ways than, we might have before, some of us are listening to audio, but it's really storytelling is what it comes down to. If we're all fascinated with storytelling, how that's delivered, we can accept changes in it. But what we can't stand is losing the storytellers. So I'm grateful that you are one of them. And it's been a real pleasure to meet you. Patrick, are there any questions or comments from the audience that you'd like to introduce?
Well, Megan, did you mention what you're going to be doing next? I realize your book is just out, but are you working on something now?
Yes, I don't know if my publisher has formally announced it yet, but I think it's okay for me to say this is a series starter. And so I have written a second book to follow this one up. And the second book follows the same characters, but instead of the book world, it is more set in the film world of LA, but with an old Hollywood film noir, that kind of a creepy vibe to it.
Great.
Still dealing with, creators and their artistic creations, but from the film side. Which and my main character in the book is a horror movie fan, and she recaps those on the side, so she's already connected with that world. And so that was a lot of really fascinating research to delve into a whole new industry, the film industry, and some of that old Hollywood lore and urban legends. There's a lot of creepy stuff that happens in Hollywood too. So
you bet. That sounds like a lot of fun.
It does. That's a place where the lines between reality and whatever fantasy are seriously blurred.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Lying is actually, an art form. So Patrick, you will love that book. So I'll definitely bring you.
Get you out here.
Yep, I will definitely bring you Malice House to read, and then you will love that one. Is there anybody that we've ignored?
No, Jel is her name, I think, Jel. Says one of the interesting aspects of the COVID limitations were that some who could not travel back to countries, they immigrated from, could gain a stronger understanding of previous immigrations, those who settled Australia or America. I'm not sure if I'm reading that whole thing properly, but yeah, it's an interesting point.
Well, yeah, we're going to see so many books coming out about pandemics and COVID, and it's already begun. I'm not sure I'm quite ready to read those yet, but I think there's going to be a point when I'm going to be ready, and it's probably going to feel really cathartic.
I think writers are choosing not to. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're all just so exhausted by it that, we don't want to dig through it again.
Yeah, exactly. I'm still in the escapist mode.
Yep.
Well, distance makes a big difference. I keep hoping that I will live long enough to see what people will write about the politics of this age, because they're just extraordinary to live through and horrifying.
Yes.
But generally, when you have a period like this, there is eventually you come out on the other side, possibly in a new reality, but at least you survive, or some people survive it anyway. So I'm hoping I'm going to be one of them, but I'll be really interested to see what the judgments are. It's hard when it's going on to make, clearly it's hard to make any kind of sound judgments. And, I was looking at Elon Musk's tweet today to, the Ukrainians and thinking, what is wrong with this man? He is so totally out of touch with reality, and Twitter will make it worse because then he can talk to more people about it. What will happen to him, for example?
It's a crazy world, but it's good fodder for fiction.
Yeah, no, it's a marvelous time for fiction. I agree, but it'll be interesting I'm an historian by training, and I'm really going to be fascinated to see what historians will have to say about all this. But let's remember Jane Austen wrote through a 20-year war where nobody knew how it was going to come out until the last battle. And, you wouldn't even know that reading her book. It's a criticism sometimes leveled at her work, that it ignores all that. So,
unfortunately, it's like the end result of where this anti-intellectual culture seems to be going. It's kind of sad.
It really is. So there have been book burnings in the past, and then people recover. So, the world's cyclical, and I agree with Ian. I think it was Ian that said it, that, the more chaotic things get, the more chance that you have for demagogues to come along and offer an easy and structured solution, because it's easier for people than actually thinking for themselves. And I think, unfortunately, that's true. So we'll find out. Anyway, Megan, it's really been a great pleasure to meet you. Thank you again for sending the signed books to us. And I think that those of you who are in our notable new fiction club will be excited to read it. And those of you who aren't can still buy one of our few remaining outside copies. So go for it. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Thank you so much again for choosing it as your pick. And great talking to you.
And you too.
All right.